90% pure. Nobody knows where he gets it, but it's everywhere. Roberts kept digging. More informants, more names, more pieces. Frank Lucas, from North Carolina, worked for Bumpy Johnson, now running his own operation, but nobody had details, no addresses, no photos, no evidence, just a name and a reputation. Roberts put together a surveillance team, 6 detectives. They started following leads. It took another 2 months before they spotted Frank. May 1971, Frank Lucas getting into a Lincoln Continental in Teaneck, New Jersey. Roberts watched through binoculars. That's him, the guy from the fight. From that day forward, Frank Lucas was under surveillance. Wiretaps on his phones, tracking devices on his cars, undercover officers watching his houses. Roberts built his case slowly, carefully. He didn't know it yet, but that photograph at the boxing match had given him everything he needed. A face, a lifestyle that didn't match any legitimate income. A target. Frank Lucas had no idea he was being watched. He continued operating, making money, expanding his territory, but he made another mistake. He kept being visible. He bought more expensive cars, a new house, threw parties. Every time Frank appeared in public, Roberts' surveillance team was there, taking photos, recording conversations, building the case. By 1973, Roberts had enough evidence to move, but he didn't want just Frank Lucas. He wanted the entire organization. Roberts convinced the FBI to get involved. Federal resources, federal wiretaps, federal prosecutors. They spent 2 more years building an ironclad case, and on January 28, 1975 at 6, federal agents surrounded Frank Lucas' house in Teaneck. They knocked on the door. Frank answered in his bathrobe. "Frank Lucas, you're under arrest for conspiracy to distribute heroin." Frank didn't resist. He'd known this was coming. His lawyer had warned him months earlier that the feds were circling, but Frank had gotten arrogant. He thought he was untouchable. As the agents handcuffed him, one of them said something Frank would never forget. "Nice coat you wore to the alley fight." Frank's face went cold. That coat, that one night, that one photograph. During the trial, the prosecutor used that photograph as evidence, not of the crime itself, but of the lifestyle. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is Frank Lucas, on March 8, 1971, sitting ringside at Madison Square Garden, wearing a $50,000 fur coat. He claimed to be a driver. He claimed to run a small furniture business. The prosecutor pointed at the photo projected on a screen. "Does this look like a driver to you?" The jury deliberated for 6 hours, guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Frank Lucas to 70 years in federal prison. Frank was 43 years old. He would die in prison, unless he made a deal. Frank sat in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. 70 years. He thought about that night at the fight. How good he'd felt. How powerful. He thought about Bumpy Johnson's advice. Stay invisible. And he thought about how one moment of vanity had destroyed everything. A few months after his conviction, federal prosecutors came to Frank with an offer. "Cooperate. Give us names. Give us corrupt cops. Give us your suppliers. We'll reduce your sentence." Frank thought about it for 3 days. He'd been betrayed by his own ego, his own need to be seen. Now the government wanted him to betray others. Frank made his decision. But that's another story. Richie Roberts became famous for taking down Frank Lucas. He eventually became a defense attorney. Ironically, he defended criminals instead of prosecuting them. Years later, a reporter asked Roberts, "How did you catch Frank Lucas?" Roberts smiled. He caught himself. He wore a $50,000 coat to a boxing match and sat ringside. He wanted the world to see him. So we did. Frank Lucas served 15 years. Got out in 1981, went back to prison in 1984 for a different drug charge, got out again in 1991. He spent his final years giving speeches about his past, telling young people not to make his mistakes. He died in 20. When journalists asked him about his biggest regret, Frank always gave the same answer. That coat. That one night. I should have stayed home. Someone asked him, if you could go back, what would you do differently? Frank Lucas thought for a long moment. I would have kept dressing like a driver. I would have kept driving a regular car. I would have stayed invisible. Because the moment you show the world who you are, you give them a target. He paused. Bumpy tried to tell me, stay invisible. But I didn't listen. I wanted to be seen. And being seen is what killed me. The reporter asked one more question. Was it worth it? That one night of feeling like you'd made it? Frank Lucas shook his head. 70 years. They gave me 70 years. I sat in a cell thinking about that coat every day for 15 years. Was it worth it? He looked directly at the camera. What do you think? The story of Frank Lucas and the chinchilla coat became legend in law enforcement circles. Police academies teach it. FBI training uses it as a case study. The lesson is always the same. Criminals who want to survive stay invisible. The ones who want to be famous end up in prison. Frank Lucas wanted both. He got one. One last thing. The next story is about the choice Frank made in that cell. The choice that made him the most hated man in the underworld. His mother was there, sitting in the back row, crying. His children were there, too young to understand what was happening, and sitting 3 rows behind them. Richie Roberts, the detective who'd brought him down. Roberts wasn't smiling. He looked almost sad, because Roberts understood something that most cops didn't. Frank Lucas wasn't different from them. He'd come from poverty. He'd tried to escape it. He'd just chosen the wrong path. Frank was taken to MCC, Metropolitan Correctional Center, a high-rise federal prison in downtown Manhattan. They put him in administrative segregation, solitary, for his own protection. Because word spreads fast in prison, and everyone knew Frank Lucas was facing 70 years, and federal prosecutors always offered deals to big targets. On his second night in solitary, Frank heard a voice from the neighboring cell. "Yo, Frank." Frank didn't answer. "I know you hear me, Frank. You thinking about talking?" Silence. "Listen carefully, brother. You talk, your family ain't safe. Your mother, your kids, your cousins back in North Carolina, none of them safe. You understand what I'm saying?" Frank understood. This was the message. This was how it worked. You keep your mouth shut, you do your time, you maintain honor, or you talk, and everyone you love pays the price. That was the code. Frank had lived by that code his entire life. But 70 years changed the equation. On the morning of February 3, 1975, Frank sat on his bunk in the cell. He'd been thinking for 3 days straight. Barely slept. Barely eaten. The guard opened the cell door. "Lucas, you got visitors. Lawyers." Frank was escorted to the attorney meeting room. Sitting there, Sterling Johnson and Thomas Spock, the prosecutors. But also, Frank's defense attorney, David Breitbart. Breitbart spoke first. "Frank, I've advised you not to cooperate. It's dangerous. You'll be a target for the rest of your life. But," he paused, "it's your decision. And if you choose to cooperate, I'll help negotiate the best deal possible." Frank looked at the prosecutors. "If I talk, what exactly do you need?" Johnson opened a briefcase, pulled out a thick folder. Inside, photographs. Dozens of them. NYPD officers, detectives, sergeants. Some Frank recognized, some he didn't. "We know corruption exists," Johnson said. "We know cops are on the take, but we need specifics. Who did you pay? How much? How often? What did they do in return?" He pulled out more files. "We need your suppliers, your distribution network, your mob connections. Everything." Frank stared at the photographs. Some of those cops had been on his payroll for years. They'd protected his operations. They'd tipped him off about raids. They'd looked the other way when his dealers got arrested. But they'd also taken his money willingly. They weren't innocent. What about my family? Frank asked. How do I know they'll be safe? Witness protection. Spock said. For you and anyone you designate after you serve your reduced sentence. Frank nodded slowly. And if I don't cooperate, what happens? Johnson's answer was blunt. You die in prison. Your empire is already destroyed. Your money is gone. Your wife is leaving you. The only question is whether you spend your last years in a cell or get a chance at freedom. Frank leaned back in his chair. He thought about his mother. She'd raised 11 children in North Carolina, worked in the fields, sacrificed everything so her kids could have better lives. And Frank had chosen crime, had made millions, had lived like a king. But he'd also ended up here, in a cell, facing 70 years. All that money, all that power, and it meant nothing. Now, what do I have to do? Frank asked quietly. Johnson slid a cooperation agreement across the table. Sign this, then you start talking. Every session is recorded. Every statement is verified. If we catch you lying, the deal is off. Frank picked up the pen. His hand hovered over the signature line. This was it. Sign, and he becomes a rat, a snitch, the most hated thing in the criminal world. Don't sign, and he dies in prison. Never sees his kids again. Never breathes free air. Frank thought about something Bumpy Johnson had told him years ago. In this game, loyalty is everything, but survival is more. Frank signed the document. The cooperation sessions started the next day. Frank sat in a secure room with prosecutors, FBI agents, and stenographers. They asked questions. Frank answered. Who was the first cop you paid off? Detective Vincent Papa, NYPD Narcotics, 1969. Gave him $10,000 to ignore my distribution network in Harlem. Who else? Sergeant Louis Diaz, Brooklyn Narcotics, $5,000 a month. He tipped me off before raids. The questions continued. Hours every day. For weeks. Frank named 52 NYPD officers, from beat cops to detectives to commanding officers. He provided dates, amounts, methods of payment. What he got in return. He described the system, how corruption worked, how some cops approached him asking for money, how others just looked the other way when he made it clear he'd pay. The prosecutors were stunned. They'd known corruption existed, but they hadn't realized how deep it went. 3/4 of my success was because of dirty cops. Frank told them in one session. I couldn't have built my empire without them. But Frank didn't just give up cops. He gave up mob connections. Mafia capos who'd helped him import heroin. Members of the Genovese family who'd protected his operations in exchange for a cut. He gave up suppliers. The Chinese merchants in Bangkok who'd sold him pure heroin. The pilots who'd smuggled it into the U.S. He gave up his own organization, his brothers, his cousins, his lieutenants, everyone who'd worked for him. Frank Lucas gave up everyone. By March 1975, federal prosecutors had enough evidence to move. On March 15th, coordinated raids hit simultaneously across New York. 6:07 a.m., federal agents and internal affairs officers arrested 52 NYPD officers at their homes, in front of their families, some still in their pajamas, charged with corruption, bribery, conspiracy. The media exploded. Biggest police corruption scandal since Serpico. The NYPD was in chaos. Who could be trusted? How deep did this go? Commissioner Michael Codd held a press conference. We're committed to rooting out corruption wherever it exists. These arrests send a message. No one is above the law. But privately, NYPD leadership was furious. Because the person who'd exposed all this corruption was a drug dealer, a criminal. And now he'd embarrassed the entire department. In prison, Frank heard about the arrests, and he knew what it meant. He was now the most hated man in every prison in America. 3 days after the arrests, Frank was moved to a different facility, under a different name, Maximum Security Witness Protection Unit, because there were contracts on his life. The mob wanted him dead. Dirty cops wanted him dead. His own former organization wanted him dead. Frank Lucas had violated the ultimate code, never snitch, and in the criminal world that was unforgivable. Frank served 15 years, from 1975 to 1981. He was released into witness protection. New name, new identity, relocated to an undisclosed location. But within 3 years, Frank violated the terms of his protection. Got caught with drugs again in 1984. Back to prison for another 7 years. Released again in 1991. This time, he stayed clean. He spent his remaining years giving speeches, telling his story, warning young people about the consequences of the drug game. In 2000, Frank did an interview with a journalist. The journalist asked him about the decision to cooperate. "Do you regret it?" Frank thought for a long time. "Regret is complicated. I regret getting into the drug game in the first place. I regret the damage I did to my community. I regret the pain I caused my family. But do you regret cooperating? Informing on all those people?" Frank's answer was honest. "Every man in prison hates a rat. I understand that. I lived by that code for years. But when I was sitting in that cell facing 70 years, I had to ask myself, what's more important? A code created by criminals, or getting a chance to see my children again? You chose your children. I chose survival." Frank corrected. "Some people call that cowardice. Some call it selfishness. I call it being human." The journalist pressed. 52 cops lost their careers because of you. 3 mafia guys went to prison. Dozens of dealers got arrested. Do you feel guilty about that? Frank's eyes went cold. Those cops chose to be corrupt. They chose to take money from drug dealers. They chose to betray their badges. I didn't force them. I just gave them the opportunity. And your own people, your brothers, your organization. Frank was quiet for a moment. That's the part I struggle with. I gave up people who were loyal to me, people who'd never betrayed me. That's the part that keeps me up at night. If you could go back, would you make the same choice? Frank nodded slowly. Yes, because I saw my children grow up. I got to breathe free air again. I got to live. And in this world, living is better than dying with honor in a cell. The interview ended, but the question remained. In 2019, Frank Lucas died at age 88. Natural causes, free man. When the news broke, reactions were mixed. Some people said, he was a monster. He poisoned communities. He corrupted cops. He deserved worse than what he got. Others said, he was a product of his environment. He did what he had to do to survive. He paid his debt. Retired Detective Richie Roberts, who'd arrested Frank 44 years earlier, made a statement. Frank Lucas was a complex man. He was a criminal, yes, but he was also honest about what he'd done. When he decided to cooperate, he didn't hold back. He told us everything. That's rare. One journalist asked Roberts, "Do you respect him for cooperating?" Roberts thought carefully before answering. "I respect that he made a choice. Right or wrong, he chose survival, and he lived with the consequences. That takes a different kind of courage. The real question isn't whether Frank Lucas was right or wrong to inform. The real question is, what would you do? 70 years in prison, never seeing your family again, dying alone in a cell, or cooperate, betray everyone you know, become the most hated man in the underworld, but get a chance at life. Frank Lucas chose life, and he spent the rest of that life knowing that in every prison in America, his name was synonymous with betrayal. But he also spent it free. That's the trade-off. That's the choice Frank made. One last thing. Some people think being a rat is the worst thing you can be. Frank Lucas proved there's something worse. Dying for a code that was created by people who'd sell you out in a heartbeat if it saved their own skin.